to install our client-side dependencies using Bower. Of course, in order to do that, we first have to have Bower installed. Bower is simply a node module that you can install using npm install. Of course, it's often a good idea to just install it globally so that it's available on all of your projects. But if you don't wish to install it globally, you can also install it just for this application, in which case you don't want it into the regular production dependencies, you'll just want it saved as a dev dependency. Now I've already got Bower installed, so I'm not going to execute these commands. We'll just move on to actually installing our dependencies. Before we install our dependencies, though, we need to have a place for those dependencies to go, so it's time to discuss our top-level folders in our project. One of the common ways to organize a project in Node is to create two directories, one typically called app and another one called public. App would be the directory where you put your Node source files, and public would be the directory where you put all of your client-side assets, such as CSS, images, and JavaScript files. In our application, we're going to vary from this just ever so slightly. Instead of calling our server-side folder app, we're going to call it server. Since our application is going to be a single-page application, I would like to use the folder named app to house our Angular files. And since that folder and this server folder are both going to contain JavaScript files, and I don't want to be dealing with any confusion when looking at file paths, I'm going to name this folder server instead of app. But I am going to follow the conventional pattern for my client-side files and put all those in a folder named public. In our application, we're going to put the typical files inside of public, and in server we're going to be putting all of our Node source code, plus our Jade views and our client-side partials. We'll be discussing the client-side partials further later on, but this will be a variation from the typical layout you'll see for a mean stack application. The reason I'm going to put my client-side partials inside of my server directory is because since we're using Angular, we're not going to have very many server-side views, and I want to be able to author my client-side views in Jade, which means that Node is actually going to have to process them as views, and can't just deliver them untouched the way it would with HTML files. That means those client-side partials are going to need to reside in the same directory as my server-side views. Now that we've got the folder that's going to contain our client-side dependencies, before we can begin installing them, we need to do one more thing and create a Bower RC file. This file will tell Bower where to install our client-side dependencies. And I specify that by just creating an object that has a key name directory. And then here I specify the path where I want to keep my client-side dependencies. I'm going to put them into a folder named vendor. And now that I've got that directory specified, I need to create my Bower JSON file. Similar to npm, I do that by typing in Bower init. Just like with npm, this is going to ask me a series of questions. And just like npm, I'm going to accept the defaults for most of these. As new versions of Bower come out, it may ask you additional questions from the ones you see here. In those cases, you can just accept the default answers. It won't hurt anything that we're doing here. Now let's take a look at our bower.json file. Once that's created, we can begin to install our client-side dependencies. We'll start by installing jQuery. The Bower commands work very similar to npm. The next dependency I want to install is Toaster, which will give us our client-side notifications. And then last we'll install Angular and two of the Angular modules that we know we're going to need in this project. Now let's go and see what that did to our project. Our Bower file now has this dependencies node right here that tells us what dependencies are installed with Bower. We've also created a new folder inside of our public folder named vendor, and inside of that there's a folder for each of the dependencies that we installed. Inside of each of these folders, you're going to see all the different files that belong to that dependency. So Bower has given us the unminified file, the minified file, the map file, any CSS files that go along with it, and any other files included in the distribution. This makes it very convenient to install and maintain our client-side dependencies.